We cannot talk about the threats to democracy and the electoral process without talking about social media. That's where truth and trust are really being put to the test these days. The online revolution of modern times has given us a lot to be thankful for and a lot to question. It's become very clear that social media is a tremendous force for good, but also can be a tool for mischief and wrongdoing. You own something very valuable, and that's your opinion and the right to express it at the ballot box. And you will be faced with an onslaught of forces out there to shape your opinion. So what should you expect? Let's dig into that a little bit with my next two guests. Elizabeth Dubois, an assistant professor of communications at the University of Ottawa and a fellow at the Public Policy Forum. And Craig Silverman is the media editor of BuzzFeed and widely regarded as an expert in fake news. It's good to see both. Thanks for coming in to talk about this. Let me start by asking you, how concerned each of you is about the possibility that this election campaign will be influenced largely through social media and what we should watch for. Elizabeth, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think that social media is definitely going to play a role in this election. We have already seen people ramping up, creating Facebook groups, Twitter campaigns. It's going to play a role. We need to remember that the vast majority of Canadians, while they are on social media, aren't necessarily trusting it as their main news source. So that gives us a bit of hope in terms of the fake news concerns. But we also know that there are foreign and domestic actors who are trying to be as innovative as possible when manipulating other people's opinions, and they're going to use every single tool in their toolbox to do that.
Craig, what's your view? How likely do you think it is that there'll be interference, and in what form will it take?
I would rate it as certainly much more likely than what we saw in 2015, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is that the practice of social media manipulation, the practice of information operations is much more widespread now, and it's much better understood by people who might want to engage in it. And government's position on some things such as Russia and other elements, it might actually cause some foreign entities to have an interest in the Canadian election much more than we've had perhaps in previous years. So I think that it is something we should be watching for. It's something we should expect on a certain degree, but probably even more so than foreign interference. What's going to happen domestically is probably the biggest thing to pay attention to, I would say.
And in which way? What do you think is going to happen domestically?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that, of course, you have genuine partisan folks who really want to advocate for their party, for their point of view. And that is an important and legitimate activity when it comes to elections. But certainly, perhaps an economic or financial opportunity to dive in and try to stoke what are already divisions that exist. So I think that element of some people thinking, hey, maybe there's a little bit of money to be made here is one thing. And I do think, frankly, already we're seeing, particularly on Facebook when it comes to groups and other sort of private or semi-private environments, we're seeing a lot of, some death threats against the Prime Minister and other people who are members of his party, and other things that are starting to well up that I think we'll start to see intensify even more as we get closer to October.
Elizabeth, do you think we need to worry more about foreign interference or domestic interference?
I think both are going to be an issue. We know that if you are not a fan of democracy, seeing chaotic democracies is a good thing in your perspective. And so the actors that have been involved in Brexit, in the US election, in France, we can expect that they're going to show up too. But like Craig said, I think the domestic one is where we have less of a grasp on what the possibilities are. We have less of a sense of how that's going to work, and we have less of a sense of how our existing electoral laws might apply and those regulations might play out.
Why does anybody want to interfere in a Canadian election? I mean, it seems like a very basic question, Craig. And I suppose let's look at the foreign side. Why does Russia care about interfering in a Canadian election? And I don't mean to malign Russia here, but we know something about the past. But why does anybody care about, to be colloquial, a little old Canadian election? What's the issue?
Well, I think there's two pieces to it. So one, just in general, as you say, not necessarily pick on Russia, but I think they've been at the forefront of trying to exert this kind of, influence through social media in other elections around the world. For them, if it's a member of NATO, if it's a leading member of the West, if they can disrupt or create chaos around an election and a perception of chaos around democracy, as Elizabeth said, that's a win for them. Specifically, though, Justin Trudeau has become a bit of an international icon for kind of liberalism, for that kind of point of view. And so I think it's not just about Canada, it's about somebody who is a symbol around the world and who has built up a pretty big profile. trying to bring him low, I think is an appealing thing for some people out there. And so that is creating perhaps international interest that might not have been there in the past.
What do you think of that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd also add on, think about the timing of our election compared to the next U.S. election. This could be a good place to test out different techniques and tools and to
If your target's really the U.S. election, let's run a test on Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. Look, I've kind of framed a question for myself as we head into the election campaign to sort of keep me vigilant when I consider content coming from, I guess, largely social media. And I guess it's this, is I'm going to ask myself every time, how do I know who's talking to me? Is that a good approach, Craig, or is that a little bit paranoid?
No, I think that's when you think about fundamental advice for the average person, asking about the source, considering the source and considering, why this particular message might be reaching you and what they're trying to get you to do or get you to think is important. It's about taking that extra little step back and thinking of the context. So the source is, who is talking to me? What do I know about this person, this website, this particular source here is really, really important. And the other thing that I would add for the average person is to realize you do have a fair amount of power there. You're somewhat powerless at times, but by choosing what to like, choosing what to retweet or share, you are actually kind of making a small vote in some way. And over time, as more and more people make those decisions, it can have an effect. So think about guarding your attention, think about thinking of the source, and think about choosing when to share, when to react to something, and when not to, so that you can sort of control how much exposure it gets.
Elizabeth, does this heighten the role for traditional media in this election campaign? What role can it play?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. When we look at the sources of information that people report still trusting, traditional media comes out ahead of social media. Even though people are using social media to get political information, traditional media is often the place they go to check something that they've seen. So as we're talking about be vigilant, try and understand what the source is, we can also be saying find sources that you think are trustworthy, make sure that that's true, and then use them a bit of a benchmark against the things you're seeing come across social media. Because social media is designed to give you more of what you already are likely to like and share and retweet. And so if you're actually going off of social media to check things and to verify, that can help.
Let me finish on this for the question for both of you. If there are people who can be exploited, Craig, by content on social media, doesn't that suggest a certain vulnerability? And my question is, why does social media find that audience in this country? Why is there an audience for this kind of information, disinformation? It would seem to suggest to at least some degree there's a level of dissatisfaction with our democracy, and so there's an audience for the disruptors. Is that fair?
I think, one of the factors that's taking place here, of course, is that it's a much more participatory medium. And so the views that might be on the fringe or on the edge that don't get much airing in mainstream media, people can coalesce around them on social media. And so, yes, I think you can see some of the fault lines that exist, and they start to be accentuated much more. And people who are like-minded come together. And one of the things that happen is kind of a group polarization dynamic where, the more you're surrounded by people who have the same point of view, the more extreme your views tend to get. And so we see that play out again and again in social media. So yes, sometimes it can sort of give you a sense of the undercurrent that maybe you don't see in everyday life. But I also think people need to kind of guard on that and not necessarily think that just because you see people talking about something on social media that it's, a widespread view.
How should you consider that kind of, when you see that kind of content, that kind of reaction, Elizabeth? What kind of weight do you give it? As Craig says, be careful about how many people we're talking about. But it does seem to suggest that this can be a gathering place for people who don't think democracy works for them.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that the people who share disinformation aren't necessarily saying they agree with it or even that they're upset by their democratic system. People like and share and repost things that are sensational, that are surprising, that go against what their expectations were. Sometimes they share it just for fun, for laughs, not because they necessarily agree with it. So thinking about counting up how much disinformation there is, even if we could get a good count on it, which is difficult, but even if we could do that, that's not a great measure of how satisfied people are with their democratic system. Definitely, it's something that we need to pay attention to and dig more into, but I'm wary of that sort of, oh, well, we see it, so it must be how people feel.
All right, lots to consider in your comments today. Craig Silverman, Elizabeth Dubois, thank you both for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.